Hi, I'm Kenneth Christopher, Assistant Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School.
This presentation is STATA Programming, Beginnings. This is being recorded and produced for global education at Harvard Medical School. First, a bit of an overview of our study design of the data that we're going to be working with. These are intensive care unit patients who have chronic liver disease, who survive hospitalization. In terms of study design, we're going to look at an exposure, which is red cell distribution width at hospital discharge. And we're going to look at an outcome of all-cause mortality 90 days following hospital discharge. The data that we're going to use is based on real data, but we're only mimicking the data structure. The real data has been expunged and replaced with data that works very well for this particular exercise, but is not actually real patient data. After opening STATA, our first screen we see is this one, and what it displays is the actual command box where you will type your commands. It gives you reviews of the commands. They will show here as you type them. It will give you variable names and then individual properties of those variables. It will give you the number of variables in your data set, the number of observations or patients in your data set, and also the size. The first step is to load our data. So there are two ways to do it. You can either type in the command to load the particular data, or you can use the icons. The icons that we can use are listed here. We have File, we have Editing icons, we have Data types of icons, Graphical Command icons, Statistics, and you can see there's a lot of icons in terms of statistics. There's some user-specific, there's ways of opening different types of windows, and then the help function, which is very helpful, especially the PDF documentation and the search and STATA command definitions. There's a lot of helpful information within this that can guide your development of STATA programming. But why don't we first import our data? And this particular data is in text data form. It's a delimited file. You could also use a standard Excel spreadsheet. You can use different types of data as well. But what we have is we have a delimited CSV, which is a comma delimited text data file. And so what we're going to do is press that part of the icon, and in a few moments it will bring up the actual set of data files that I have stored in this computer. We will browse to find our data, and our particular file that we're going to use, I have named it after one of the courses, the GCSRT course that we run at Harvard Medical School through global education. This provides you with a preview of the file itself and lets you make sure that this is the file that you indeed want. And if you're happy with the preview, you press OK. And what that does is it loads the data. And so what we have noticed already is we have a command statement here. That command statement is here as well. And what this tells us is that we have 35 variables and 5,066 observations. If we look here, we have 33 variables and 5,066 observations. So in this particular data set, there are 5,066 patients. The size of the data set is listed here. Some of the data sets are extremely large. This is a relatively large data set of 5,000 patients. Here are the variables that are within the data set that we imported. We have an identification number variable. We have gender, race. This is the date of death. This is the ICU admission. This is the hospital admission. This is the discharge date. This is the age of the patient, comorbidity, type of patient, etc. So for now, what we have is we have our data imported into STATA, and the next step is to do a summarize command, which will allow us to inspect all of the data. Summarize as a single word will summarize the entire data set. So typing in the command and pressing return gives you a summary of all the data that is within. So by typing summarize, we get our variable, the number of observations for that particular variable, the mean, the standard deviation, the minimum, and the maximum. And so this allows you to start to inspect the data. For instance, the age is present in 5,066 patients. The mean age of these patients is 59 years, 0.7 years, so 59.7 years. Standard deviation is 14.67, and the minimum is 16.67, and the maximum age of the patients is 104.22. Seems like that might be an outlier, might be a little bit too old for someone with chronic liver disease. When we look at other variables, we see that things like total bilirubin, which is a laboratory value, is only present in 4,681 patients, not all 5,066. So the certain variables won't be present in every single patient. This again allows you to inspect all of the variables and gives you a little bit of quality control in terms of looking at the particular variable. So if we wanted to figure out what the proportion of patients that have certain types of variables, we can do a statistics command where we click on the icon of statistics. We click on summaries, tables, and tests. We click on summary and descriptive statistics, and then come over to proportions. By clicking on proportions, it will open up the proportion window. And if we want to look at the proportion of patients that have trauma in our data set, we can either type in trauma or we can click here and choose from the variables. Let's look at trauma and let's look at intubation, which is mechanical ventilation, so breathing assistance machine. And by having a space in between, it'll give us proportions of both of those. So we press OK, and what the command is proportion trauma intubation. If you cut and paste this command, you will get exactly the same output. So there's two ways to tell STATA to do something. One is to go through the icons as we did, and that produces this statement, or to actually type in this statement or cut and paste this statement. And you will see, in terms of our trauma, 0 is without, 1 is with. So in this, our proportion of trauma patients in the entire 5,066 data set is 0.0647, or 6.47%. If we look at intubation, which are the proportion of patients who are on breathing machines, this is not, and this is present. So these are the patients, the number 1 are the patients with breathing machines. So this is 0.2269, which is 26.9%. If we do the command proportion trauma intubation by typing it in or copying the command, pasting it, and pressing return, we get exactly the same output. The point is that there's two ways to do everything. You can use the icons in and of themselves, or you can actually cut and paste commands that you have perhaps collected in a Word document or something to that effect. In terms of looking at simple graphical commands, if we click on graphics, we can do what's called a histogram. of a particular variable. And we're going to look at something called the MELD score, which if we look up in our variable table, will be here. And we will click on data are continuous, meaning that this goes from 0 to 100. We're going to look at, in terms of, we can look at percent on the y-axis, and we can select the number of bins, or the width of bins, meaning the actual column width itself. If we press OK, what we're going to get is a histogram command of MELD score. MELD score is a liver-specific severity score. And what we get here in our histogram is we get the percent of patients with the various MELD day 0 score. And you notice it doesn't go all the way to 0. The lowest MELD score that exists is 6, and the highest MELD score in our data sample is up above 60. MELD score is determined by particular laboratory values measured in patients with chronic liver disease. This type of histogram shows us that the data is skewed, whereby we have more observations in more of the normal range than we have here. So we don't get what would be called a normal distribution. And if we actually wanted to test for that, we could look at the histogram and ask for what's called normal. And what that will do is actually plot a normal curve onto the data. And we can see that clearly this data, because of its skewed nature, does not look like it obeys the predicted normal curve. It's important to inspect your data to determine what type of analysis one would want to do. So, for instance, if we decided then to continue to inspect our data, we can do a simple summary and descriptive statistics, summary statistics, of that same variable. We're going to look at MELD day 0. And if we just look at our standard display, that will give us standard summarized statistics that we saw before. In terms of our observations, 3,779, the mean score, 16.28, the standard deviation, the minimum, which is 6, which is the lowest one can have, and the maximum is 64, which we saw in the histogram. If we want to get more detailed summary statistics, we can do the same operation. We can do MELD score day 0, but look at display additional statistics. And what this does is it gives us more information. It gives us the same mean, 16.28, the standard deviation of 9, but it also gives us the 50th percentile mark, which is the median. So we know our median is 14, and also gives the interquartile range. So the 25th percentile would be 9, the 70th percentile is 21. This way, this allows you to compare your mean standard deviation to the median interquartile range. This is a more detailed inspection. If you cut and paste this command, copy, paste, return, you get exactly the same output. So again, you can use icon-based, or you can actually cut and paste from a command document or commands that you know. Let's look at a box plot. So a box plot is another way to inspect your data. And if we look at the same variable, MELD score, what we're going to do is we're going to graphically look at that particular variable in what's called a box plot. So it's a simple command, graph box meld day 0. And what it produces is a box plot which gives us the median and the interquartile range. And then what it gives us is it gives us our outliers, which are these particular dots. So this in and of itself is helpful, but what's even more interesting is we can do a box plot of two different categories. So if we have our variable meld day 0 and we want to split it into different groups, we can do a grouping variable of, say, gender. And that will give us two box plots, one of men and one of females. Females or males. And so what we can see is the meld day 0 box plot of females relative to the meld day 0 box plot of males. And what we can see here is the median is different, and there's more variability in terms of the males, or more outliers in terms of the males than the females. We can do the same sort of thing in terms of graphical output with histograms. So if we wanted to do meld day 0, we can find our meld day 0, which is already here, but this is how we do it. We can choose our y-axis as %, and if we can do it based on groups by drawing subgraphs. So I clicked on the by command based on subgraphs, and we're going to do based on gender. And we're choosing to split the histograms into males and females. And so this will work a little bit, and what we find is that we have the same sort of distribution, this skewed distribution, in females and in males. So again, this allows us to inspect our data based on graphs by gender. If we wanted to do a simple scatter plot, we can do what's called a two-way graph, and we can create that two-way graphs using, say, a basic plot and a scatter in the variables that we're interested in. So we can look at, again, meld score, because that's a continuous variable, and we can look at age, which is a continuous variable. And just to make this simple, we can do a simple scatter plot with one variable of meld and one variable of age, and we can type in accept. So that's our plot 1. If we press OK, that will give us this particular scatter plot. So by looking at a scatter plot, what you're trying to do is approximate a line in 5,000 dots in your head to try to see if there is some sort of relationship. And it appears that most of the data is in this particular zone. If we wanted to do the same thing in terms of a scatter plot, we do two-way graphs. Our plot 1 is still there. That's exactly what we just created. Plot 1 is still there, the exact same thing. If we look at it, it is meld day 0 relative to age. That's fine, we will do the same plot. But if we wanted to do it among different genders, we can do the by command, and this will allow us to do subgroups based on gender. So what we have here is we have two separate plots based on gender. And it looks like there is a little bit more variability in the males than in the females if we just inspect the scatter plots in and of themselves. So this is inspecting data, relatively basic commands in STATA. The biggest point is to look at is that we can create commands using the icons, or we can actually type commands in directly into the command window. Let's explore some other things. And so if we want to look at, say, a table, we can look at a two-way table with measures of association. So let's say we want to look at the proportion of patients with trauma who have sepsis. So what we can do with tables is we can do all this customization. So the row variable I'm choosing to be trauma, and the column variable is sepsis. I'm choosing a Pearson chi-square test statistic, and in terms of the cell contents, I would like to have within column relative frequencies and within row relative frequencies. If I press OK, it gives me this relatively complicated programming command called tabulate, which is a table. The two variables that I'm interested in, trauma and sepsis, comma, chi2, which is chi-square, which is the type of statistic that I'm asking for, and then column row, which is this particular structure. And what this table tells us, if we click more, we'll get the full table with the statistic at the bottom. And what this tells us is if we look at trauma, 0 being absent, 1 being present, and we look at sepsis, 0 being absent, 1 being present, we can see that there are 27 patients who have trauma and sepsis. The total number of patients with sepsis in this data set would be 969, because this is the sepsis present column. The total number of patients with trauma would be 328. The total number of patients in the data set that we're looking at is 5,066. Most patients do not have trauma, 4,738, and most patients don't have sepsis. So the majority of patients, 3,796, do not have either trauma or sepsis. Now, if we look at the patients with sepsis, what we find is 97% of them do not have trauma, and 2% of them do, because we have 942 out of 969 do not have trauma, 97%. And if we look at 27 divided by 969, we would get 2%. So this table is very informative in terms of looking at the same sort of thing we did before, proportions. This also provides us with a test statistic called the Pearson chi-square, which is what we asked for, which gives us the Pearson chi-square result of 26.9, but more importantly, the p-value, which is less than 0.05, indicating that there are differences in the cells in terms of the numbers of patients with regard to trauma and sepsis. And we sort of can probably anticipate that because there are large differences between those patients who have both trauma and sepsis and those patients who have neither trauma nor sepsis. So in this very basic video, what we have done is we have shown how to use summarize, proportion commands, basic histogram commands, basic graph box commands and some two-way scatter commands to get you up and running and familiar with how the icon and also typing in commands will work with STATA. I hope this was helpful in terms of your basic introduction to STATA programming. Thank you very much.